Ananta Aspen Center, Mr. T.N. Nenan. Before I request Mr. Nenan to begin the session, may I request all of you to kindly put your phones on silent mode? Thank you so much. Mr. Nenan.
Secretary Dr. Mead, the ambassador from Mexico, Mr. Noelat, other ambassadors and friends. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome the very distinguished Dr. Mead to this session this morning. Secretary Mead is a lawyer and an economist with a PhD from Yale University. He's had a distinguished career in finance. He's headed, I think, a rural bank. He dealt with pension issues and has previously been Secretary for Energy and Secretary for Finance. You wouldn't think that somebody at 45 could have done all that already, so I'm sure he's headed for even higher things and greater things. And so it's a very special privilege to have you with us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Mexico, it is Latin America's second largest economy with a population of 120 million people and a per capita income that's about 7 times India's. Mexico is, of course, part of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and 80% of its exports are to the US. I think some Indian companies have used investment in Mexico as a gateway to the US market. As Foreign Secretary, Dr. Mead is in the happy position because Mexico has no conflict with any country, and so he's busy building relationships as he goes around the world. So we'll start with some opening comments by you, and I'll then interact with you for a brief while with some questions, and then we'll have questions from the floor. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the Aspen Institute. Thank you to T.N. Nenan for having me here and allowing me to speak. Muchas gracias a la comunidad latinoamericana que vino aquí a saludarme. The Latin America community makes up about half of the audience, so I could almost give the speech in Spanish, which would actually work much better for me. I will divide my brief presentation to try to transmit a couple of ideas. Give you a sense as what Mexico is in terms of its size, its importance. Give you a sense as to what Mexico is doing in terms of structural reforms, what Mexico is trying to do in terms of its foreign policy, to which many here, good friends, can attest in terms of what we're doing specifically with Latin America, and what our ambition is specifically with India. Mexico first is a democracy. It's a stable and large democracy. Of course, when one is in India, the large part doesn't really work as well as it works everywhere else in the world. India incorporated more voters for the first time this election than Mexico has population. But when one is outside of India, saying that Mexico is a large democracy is something that is worthwhile noting. Mexico, for the last 80 years, since 1934, has had stable elections and stable transition of powers every 6 years, which is something that cannot be said by a large amount of countries. Mexico has some characteristics that have distinguished it for the last 20 or so years. We are a large economy, $1.2 trillion, as T.N. Nenan said. That would make us the fourth largest economy in Latin, well, the fourth largest economy in the Americas, after the US, Canada, and Brazil. Although at some point, at the rate at which Canada and Mexico are growing, we will end up being the third largest economy in Latin America, in the Americas. We're the 14th largest economy in the world. We have a large population, we have a large internal market, and we have been characterized for the last 20 years as having a very good macroeconomic. In general, we have stable macro, we have a low debt to GDP ratio, we have not only low inflation, but also inflation rate expectations. We have a strong financial sector, an independent central bank. We have, in general, had very good conditions for a stable environment. We are an economy that is easy to get in and it is easy to get out. We have an important range of free trade agreements. The most well-known, as was commented, was NAFTA, but it is not our only one. We have 12 free trade agreements that give us access to more than 45 countries in the world. So that is something that has made Mexico attractive. But even though all of this has been true, Mexico has not enjoyed as strong a growth rate as some of our other partners within Latin America or in the world. So that meant that in a way, having good macro was not enough, and we needed to have to find other sources of growth. For a long time, it used to be the case that being an open economy in and of itself was a positive driver of growth. And for Mexico, it worked. We have had low growth rates, but we have had growth rates that have been above those of our main trading partners for the last decade. This is something that happened only for the first time in Mexico. If you look at the information from this trimester, Mexico was the country that grew the most out of all of the OECD countries. That means that the OECD countries are not growing very much, but that means that Mexico, as compared to that grouping of countries that are also a group of countries that are relatively open, has performed adequately well. But in order to find more sources of growth, we have engaged in an important process of structural reforms. To create more growth, fiscal policy is important, monetary policy is important, but both of those policies have shown that they have real limits. You cannot abuse fiscal policy, otherwise it will become unsustainable. You cannot abuse monetary policy, otherwise it will create instability. So the other source of future and stable growth was to engage in a path of structural reforms. Mexico has not enjoyed a majority in Congress since 1997. That means that we have diagnosed ourselves a lot in terms of what reforms needed to be done, but we have not been able to generate political consensus around those reforms. In these first couple of years of President Peña Nieto, we have managed to create political and broad consensus, first on the agenda, what were the issues that Mexico needed to work on, and then we were able to translate that consensus, that agreement, into specific legal implementations and legal modifications, in many cases at the level of our Constitution. So in the last couple of years, and I would be happy to talk about them in more detail as we move along, we did relevant financial reform. We modified all of the legal statutes surrounding our financial sector in order to translate the relative strength of that financial sector into a financial sector that was more inclusive, that would lend more, and that would provide better services for savings. We modified our labor market so as to make it more flexible, so as to allow more flexibility in terms of its contracts, and also to make it more transparent and to make the relationship between unions and workers more accountable and more transparent. We did meaningful telecommunications reform that will allow us to include more competitiveness and to have a telecommunications reform that allowed for more services and better access for the Mexican population. We did very meaningful energy reform. Mexico had not reformed in its energy sector for more than 70 years. And we were able to create a reform, an aggressive reform at the constitutional level that would enable Mexico to attract more capital and more technology. That is what Mexico needs in the face of heavy challenges that we now have in the hydrocarbon sector. And this capital and this technology will allow Mexico to remain competitive and to remain an important source for energy for the development of our country and for our global participation. We, of course, did also important antitrust reform, which allowed us to include the best practices of the OECD at a constitutional level in order to ensure that we would have good prices and more competition in relevant sectors in our economy. All of that we did while allowing transparency to become a common thread in all of these reforms, and transparency in and of itself an important reform. We did political reform and education reform. All of these elements have translated itself into a country that today can show a higher expectation of growth for the near future and for the long future in terms of what we have done in energy. Mexico is a country of multiple belongings on many levels. Multiple belongings geographically, multiple economic belongings, and multiple belongings in terms of the challenges that we face. It was said at the outset that Mexico is very much North American, and it's true. Mexico trades $1 million every minute with the US. Our trade with the US amounts to $1.4 billion daily, which is more than $500 billion every year. That means that with the US, we talk about a lot of things. We talk about security, which is a shared concern. We talk about migration, which is something that Mexico and the US should talk about, but which is something that Mexico and India, vis-a-vis the US, should talk about as well, given that we both have big diasporas in the US. But we also talk with the US about education, about how to make our border more competitive, about logistics, about women empowerment, about how to foster educational exchanges. And that dialogue, I think, is a dialogue that Mexico has, where more parties should also become involved. But Mexico is more than just its relationship with the US. Mexico is very much a Caribbean country, and the Caribbean is a relevant region. If you take into consideration the population of Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, they have the same amount of population as Canada does. And Mexico takes the fact that there are third border very seriously, and we are one of the largest investors and trading partners to the Caribbean. We share opportunities, we share challenges, and we work together to overcome those challenges and to take advantage of those opportunities. We're very much Central America, as can be attested by the fact that many of the ambassadors of Central America were kind enough to come here today. Just to put it in perspective, Mexico trades today with Central America more than we trade with Spain. And to put that number into perspective, Mexico trades with Spain and with Central America more than India trades with Brazil. So that means that Central America today is a relevant partner to Mexico in terms of trade and in terms of investment. If one asks a Mexican to define itself geopolitically, the Mexican will say that he is Latin American, which means that we believe that Octavio Paz, which brings together Mexico and India, together with Vargas Llosa, together with José Luis Borges, is first of all a Latin American before being a Colombian, a Peruvian, or a Mexican. But it also means that Mexico is one of the largest players within the Latin American region. We have worked in a very innovative integration process with the Pacific Alliance, with Colombia, with Peru, and with Chile, that had made this region one of the regions where tourism is growing the most, where goods, services, and people are freer now to move and more integrated than elsewhere in our Latin American history or in the Latin American region. But our work with Latin America doesn't stop with the Pacific Alliance. We are the fourth largest trading partner to Latin America and one of the most important investors in each and every one of the Latin American countries, to say nothing about the history and the culture that we change. Finally, from a geographic perspective, we share the Asia-Pacific basin, and we have worked hard to be part of the dynamism that the Asia-Pacific region implies. Beyond geography, Mexico also has important belongings from an economic perspective. One of those important belongings is a belonging to the G20 that we share with India. And Mexico strongly believes that we should take advantage of that economic belonging. And if one looks at the G20, one would be hard-pressed to identify a country within the G20 that should not be there, and one would be hard-pressed to identify a country outside of the G20 that should be part of the G20. So it makes a lot of sense for countries within the G20 to construct, God bless you, to construct an important and meaningful relationship amongst ourselves. And if one looks at the relationship that Mexico has with other G20 countries, in some cases, as with the US, Canada, the UK, Germany, the relationship is very intense under any measure that you look at it. But in some countries, the relationship is not as strong as we would want it to be. That is the case, for example, of South Africa, where I was just at, and where we would want to construct an important and meaningful relationship. But an interesting surprise within the G20 is how the Mexico-India relationship has evolved. 4 or 5 years ago, the relationship of Mexico and India was very close politically, was very close diplomatically. We enjoy a good level of friendship and a good level of dialogue, but the numbers between Mexico and India have increased much more than we sometimes give it attention to. Mexico and India today trade more than $6.6 billion every year, almost 7. It has doubled in the last 4 years. So that means that vis-a-vis the G20 context, India and Mexico have moved from being at the bottom end of the G20 in terms of the importance of its trade relationship to being in the top 7 if you add up the importance of Mexico to India and of India to Mexico. Mexico has become the largest source of foreign direct investment for India in Latin America, and it is the first recipient of foreign direct investment of India in Latin America. 45,000 people from India enjoyed Mexico as a tourism destination. Almost 20,000 Mexicans enjoyed India as a tourism destination. Those numbers have been growing dramatically, and they should continue to grow as time moves on. We have not yet found as much content in our academic exchanges and in the work that we are doing together in science and technology, which is a challenge that we should face. But the numbers are growing to reflect the importance of both Mexico and India within the G20 context. And what we want to do today in this trip, in this binational, is to signal that Mexico has an ambition to really consolidate that relationship that has shown a lot of promise in the recent past and that shows a lot of promise for the recent future. Octavio Paz, who wrote Light of India, who was an ambassador here at some point and who today would be celebrating his 100th birthday, invited us always to deserve our dreams. And what Mexico dreams for today is to have a stronger, a more strategic, and a more systematic relationship with India. I thank you for your attention and for the invitation to speak with you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mead, for that wide-ranging and comprehensive survey. I would like to start by asking you if you could explain something about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which you have joined. From India, there is some concern about whether this is sidestepping multilateral trade arrangements and whether some of the issues that would come in would go beyond what you would actually be able to do through the WTO. So, and very little or not enough is known publicly what exactly is happening. So if you could explain that, it would,
yes,
I think, be most helpful.
Two levels. I think Mexico believes very much in the World Trade Organization. So much so that we had a candidate in the process. Mexico not only wants to become a part of the World Trade Organization, we had the ambition of actually heading the World Trade Organization. And we came quite close. It's always disappointing to come in second, but I think that the fact that Mexico participated and participated with a strong candidate, the former Secretary of Trade in Mexico, who was responsible for not just NAFTA, but for the trade agreement with, for example, Japan, Costa Rica, and others. We thought we had a candidate that had a good experience within government and outside of government, and that signaled the commitment of a story that has in general, a country that has in general a good story around trade, and that was therefore able to produce a candidate that we thought would be competitive within the World Trade Organization process. So I think that signals that Mexico is committed to trade and committed to the World Trade Organization. A second element behind Mexico's decision to participate in TPP is the countries that are participating in that negotiation explain a large part of the world GDP and a large part of the growth dynamism that the world is experiencing today. About a third of the growth of the world today is coming out of the countries that are participating at TPP. And more broadly, Mexico has been successful in constructing value chains, especially in the case of North America. So for Mexico, strategically, it's very important to preserve and to enhance the advantages of the environment that has allowed us to have and to construct these value chains. So any negotiation that the US and Canada are a part of is a negotiation that's important for Mexico. The other relevant negotiation that is happening today is the US-EU, the TTIP negotiation process. As you know, Canada, Mexico, and the US, if that process is successful, will each of us have a bilateral agreement with the European Union. Under Mexico's perspective, it would have been better to do it as a regional arrangement from the outset and have a North America, European Union type of trade negotiation. But even within that negotiation, the interest of the business community of Mexico, and we think also Canada, the US, and the EU, is to preserve the characteristics that have allowed NAFTA to result in such successful value-added chains. So summarizing, for Mexico, it's important to participate in negotiation processes with our main trading partners. It is important to participate in the Asia region, either through TPP or through the Pacific Alliance. If you look at the Pacific Alliance bylines, they specifically was constructed, amongst other things, to become a bridge from the Pacific Americas to the Pacific region in Asia, which we think is important. And in general, we do want to diversify our sources of growth and our economic relationships.
Thank you. You are part of NAFTA, and when NAFTA was signed, there was some concern in the US that, as one presidential candidate put it, there'd be a great sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico. And when I visited Mexico many years ago, there was some sense of some dissatisfaction within Mexico with the way it was working. And this is a relevant question for us here because India is a large economy with smaller economies surrounding us within South Asia. And while we may want to have freer trade relationships, they fear that they might get swamped. So how does it work from the perspective of a smaller economy dealing with a larger economy when you get into that kind of a free trade arrangement?
I think it's interesting when one looks at NAFTA to look at what was said 20 years ago and to look at what has happened 20 years since. First, people thought that NAFTA would enable trade to grow and would enable, in the case of Mexico, for exports to grow. Just to put in perspective what has happened in 20 years, Mexico at the time was exporting about $18 billion. Today, Mexico exports $1 billion every day. So for the first time last year, Mexico broke the barrier of exporting more than $1 billion daily. Secondly, people thought that the patterns of trade would be first in final goods, and that we would be buying mid and high-end technology from the US, and that we would be exporting basically manufactured goods. And 20 years have gone by, and trade has become trade mostly in intermediate goods, in generating value chains. And Mexico has become, if one looks again at the G20, high and mid manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. Mexico is the 5th largest country in that metric, and Mexico is the top 3, it's within the top 3 most open economies within the G20. So when one looks at Mexico today, one sees a country, for example, that is the 4th largest exporter in cars, which is the most important builder of kitchens, for example, in the world, amongst the most important producers, actually the most important producer of smartphones, the most important producer, one of the most important producers of electronic components for computers. So the way I think that trade impacted the way that Mexico is developing and has developed is not what one would have thought 20 years back. And I think that NAFTA was a successful experiment in terms of bringing together economies that were not equal, and that has provided value, we think, both for Mexico and for the US. And just one final comment. Even though Mexico and the US relationship is important in terms of trade, it explained more than 90% of our export markets 10 years ago. Today, it explains 76. That's 14 percentage points lower. which means that Mexico's growth in terms of export destinations is today more in Asia, in Europe, and in Latin America than it is in the US, while at the same time we are gaining market share in the US from 10 to 13% of their markets. So I think that trade from that perspective has been a successful partnership, has generated value for the US and for Mexico. And for Mexico, it has enabled to generate value in Central America, in Latin America, within the Asia Pacific, and also in the case of Europe. And also in the case of India. If one looks, for example, as where Mexico is investing today in India, Mexico is investing in India so that we are now part of India's value chain. So the most important producers of auto parts in Mexico have invested now in India and are part of the Indian value chain in terms of what India is manufacturing today. So I think that has opened up opportunities, not just in the US, but for example, in the case of Mexico and India, who today, as a country, would be amongst its top 10 trading partners.
Okay. The other question is a domestic one. And again, I'm looking at this from the Indian context. We have an active debate about replacing subsidies on goods with cash transfers. And I think Mexico is one of the countries which probably has more experience than most, along with Brazil. So I'm sure people would like to listen to you on how this has worked, what are the pitfalls or risks involved in this, and what's the best way to deal with it.
When one looks again at belongings, we spoke about the geographic belongings, we spoke about the economic belongings, but there's also another set of belongings that have to do with the challenges that we face. And from that perspective, Mexico and India are a couple of countries that share belongings because of the challenges that we face in terms of poverty and in terms of inequality. Mexico has done many interesting things in terms of combating poverty. First of all, we have come a long way into measuring it. So we have gone beyond just measuring poverty as just an income issue. And we have understood poverty as something that is more multidimensional in terms of the way that we measure it and in terms of what causes it. So today in Mexico, when we look at poverty, we look at poverty of income, but we also look at poverty in terms of whether or not you're getting enough to eat, whether or not you have access to education, to electricity, to solid cement floor, solid structures in your house. And that way of looking at poverty is more nuanced, and it's also more useful in terms of designing policy to provide access to those elements that will allow you to grow out of poverty. Mexico's story these last 20 years means that we still have important challenges. President Peña Nieto has recognized that more than 7 million people in Mexico go hungry every day. So the poverty is still very much a relevant issue in terms of our public policy and our policy debates. But from a relative perspective, Mexico has done well in generating access to many of these elements that you point out. And important in that process has been our conditional cash transfer programs. So the cash transfer were made contingent on the family getting access to health and getting access to education. From where the program is designed to today, there have been many adjustments. In some cases, recognizing, for example, that some families that were amongst the extreme poor were not getting support from the government because there was no school that they could take their children to, and there were no health services that could be provided to their families. So in a way, making the cash transfer conditional on giving your kids access to security and health was not possible because you were in extreme poverty. So that part of it was addressed by focusing on the municipalities that were more challenged in terms of access to health, to education. And secondly, it's important to generate a scheme that would allow you to graduate outside of poverty. So conditional cash transfers programs face the difficulty of finding a way to phase out of the program rather than become reliant on the cash transfers that you are getting. But we think all in all, it's been a positive experience. It has allowed us to understand better how poverty works and what type of challenges you face. It's an experience that's worthwhile sharing, discussing, looking at, understanding, and it is a dialogue that we would very much think would be to the benefit of both India and Mexico, to understand the benefits of the approaches that we both have followed.
Okay, turning to the G20, in which both our countries are members. I think there is a sense here that this is a group that is yielding diminishing returns and maybe running out of an effective agenda. How do you see it?
I think the G20 is a very positive phenomenon in terms of global governance. There are many issues for which 193 are not only necessary but positive and constructive in terms of building consensus. We think, and that is something that we share with India as well, the definition, for example, of the development agenda post-2015 requires the participation of the 193. There is no single case where 7 is enough. So clearly you needed something between the 7 and the 193. And the 20, I think, is an interesting, not only number, but an interesting grouping. You have countries that are consumers and producers of energy, for example. You have consumers that are middle income. You have rich countries. You have poor countries. So having all of those visions in the table, we think is positive. And we think that the G20 has garnered some positive results. We think it was useful within the context of the crisis to coordinate macro policies. We think it was useful in the context of the crisis to identify shortfallings in the way that the financial sector has been regulated. But beyond that, where I think that the G20 has been powerful is when they have been able to identify and to put behind specific topics of the multilateral agenda the political will of the G20. For example, taxes. If you look at the way that we have moved in terms of combating base erosion and tax shifting.
That's one of the early achievements, but it's...
Not quite early. If you look at how much we have moved in taxes, the last G20, we moved from a paradigm where first you could not have access to tax information, and now you are moving into a paradigm where the tax information is automatic. That happened only last year. It might not have been as splashy, but if you look on topic by topic basis, some of the items of the multilateral agenda that were stuck for years have moved once that the G20 chose to place focus in. For example, financial inclusion. That was something that we all talked about, where there were lots of interesting examples in Asia and the rest of, and today, almost every G20 country has a financial inclusion strategy. Yes. It is something that we now measure. So it might not be dramatic, but there are issues where the international community has been working for a long time. And if you manage to get the political will and the attention of the G20 leaders, those issues are able to move faster along than they had in the absence of those issues becoming part of the G20 process. So I think it's an interesting process that has and that produces worthwhile results.
Okay. In the same way that the G7 had to reach out and become part of the G20, there has been talk for a long time about reform of the UN system and changing the representation in the Security Council, where countries like India, Germany, and Japan have one position, and Mexico, with others, has a different position.
Yes.
So how do you see the best way to reform the Security Council and UN system?
I think that Mexico and India share some commonalities in the diagnostics. I think we both believe that the Security Council is not representative enough. We both think that the veto has been abused in terms of the Security Council, and we think that the governance has not been well served by the Security Council that we have today. India and Mexico, I think, disagree in what should be done in terms of reforming the Security Council. But the very fact that we agree that something needs to be done, I think, gives us common grounds to talk. Mexico believes that the Security Council should be reformed by creating a third level of membership. So you have permanent members and you have non-permanent members. Mexico thinks there should be a third category of long-term, non-permanent members. And we think that those long-term, non-permanent members should serve for longer periods of time and they should be re-elected. And we think that that has a couple of advantages. First, it creates a sense of accountability by introducing some democratic processes to the selection of the Security Council. And the fact that you are re-elected would show that you introduced value and that you adequately reflected the interests of the global constituency, but specifically of your regional constituency. And by having them being non-permanent, you would not replace or you would not repeat some of the errors or some of the excesses that the format and the definition of the permanent members would have. So again, we think that both of us are not satisfied, India and Mexico, with the way that the Security Council is working, but I think that we have different views as to how that should be addressed, and Mexico's view is of the fact that Security Council should become more accountable and more representative, and we think that the figure to do it would be that figure.
Do you see the prospect of any change in the foreseeable future?
We think that the fact that the UN is going to be 70 years old next year introduces a focal point in that debate. We think that people should seriously start a dialogue where we confront the different ways to solve or to modify the Security Council so as to make it more responsive. And I think that we would have to show flexibility in order to try to get that reform process through. So I don't know whether we would be able to find successful agreement on the issue or not, but I do think that the fact that we are going to be celebrating 70 years and that there is broad dissatisfaction with the current state of global governance will at the very least ensure that we will have a more hearty debate, hopefully a more constructive debate in the next year.
I'll ask you one more question before we turn to the floor, which is to do with your very special and privileged relationship with the United States. Can that also be a constraint in your conduct of foreign policy?
I think if you look at what I tried to do in the presentation was try to argue that Mexico had multiple belongings. Of course, the economic relationship with the United States is very important, and that means that the dialogue that we have with the United States is very broad. Again, any country where you have 1 million legal crossings every day of the border, any country that has 14,000 trailers move in and out of the country every day that trades more than $1 million every minute, those countries have a lot to talk about. And that dialogue has a very high degree of content in the bilateral level. But the things that we talk about in some cases are US-Mexico specific, but in some cases they have a broader agenda. When we talk about diasporas and immigration reform, that's very much a US-Mexico issue, and that's very much an India-US issue. That at some point should be an interesting issue for Mexico and India to also talk about and to discuss. But if you look at the importance of Mexico to Central America, or of Mexico to the Caribbean, or of Mexico to Latin America, or of Mexico as a player within the Asia-Pacific region, or of Mexico as a player in the G20, and if you look at the importance, for example, of Mexico and India to each other, you have a sense that Mexico has a more global voice. We have, of course, a regional presence, but you cannot have meaningful conversations about many issues if Mexico, you cannot talk about migration, but you cannot talk about climate change. You cannot talk about security if Mexico is not part of that debate, and that goes beyond just the US-Mexico relationship. Mexico, I think, has carried, and India is a good historical witness to that, a relationship that is cemented in very profound and very deep foreign policy considerations, foreign policy principles that Mexico has been well regarded of, and we're very independent in the way that we conduct our foreign policy. We have a very intense dialogue with the US, but we have a very large engagement with the rest of the world community, and we believe that we should take advantage of those belongings, not just of the geographic belongings, but also the economic, the cultural, and the challenges that we face that introduce us into a different set of people that we have to be able to speak with. And I think that if you look at Mexico and India, those are countries where we have, in some senses, as deep a commonality as we have with the US. For example, Mexico and India, and this is something that everybody points out, but that is true, are one of the few millennials, countries with millennial cultures. That sense of belonging we do not have, for example, in the Mexico-US relationship. In the Mexico-India relationship, we can talk about diasporas. India has 25 million. Mexico probably has a larger number. The US cannot talk about diasporas in the same way as Mexico and India can talk about diasporas. And if you look again at trade between Mexico and India and the rate at which it is growing, that means that we are becoming more relevant partners to each other that sometimes we realize at the level of governments. And that is something that we should try to foster, and that is the type of relationship that Mexico wants to be the servant of in the case of India.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to take questions from the floor. For the benefit of everybody else present, I would request you to please introduce yourself and for Dr.
My name is Kishan Rana, formerly a member of the Foreign Service. Mexico and India, first of all, Mr. Secretary, welcome to India.
Thank you.
Mexico and India share one important commonality in that we are both large federal countries. And that federal structure, when it comes to foreign affairs, has a special context. Mexico's provinces have, I understand, foreign affairs advisors. And there is, in fact, even a grouping of Mexican states that interchanges information on how they deal with external issues. Can you say a little bit about that? And my second question is, I understand that Mexico is in the process of establishing a national consultation mechanism with, on foreign affairs, which brings in private sector, non-state actors, as well as state actors. This again is something that we desperately need in India. Any comments on that? Thank you, sir.
Very briefly, Mexico has planning embedded at a constitutional level. And that means that every change of government, we have to construct, we have to review long-term plans, but we also have to construct a national development plan, and within it, embedded within it, sectoral development plans. And the way that our constitution mandates that we construct those development plans means that we have to engage in broad dialogue. So for the specific purpose of our foreign policy, we already had that process, and the results of that process were presented in our foreign policy development plan for the next 5 years. So we consulted with states, with municipalities, with civil society, with government, with academia, and all of that feedback that we received was reflected in our foreign policy priorities, which basically today mean that we have to work through our foreign policy to promote inclusiveness, to promote prosperity, to construct a Mexico at peace, and a Mexico that has access to a high-quality education. And for that purpose, our foreign policy mandate is to take advantage of our belongings, geographical, economic, multilateral, cultural, and translate those belongings into opportunity to construct this more inclusive, prosperous, better educated, and at peace Mexico. And from the point of view of states and municipalities, it's true in Mexico and elsewhere that the monopoly of foreign relationships is no longer just a monopoly of states at federal level, but it's something that we engage in public diplomacy, in cultural diplomacy, in states-to-state diplomacy, even in city-to-city diplomacy. So we have worked at the federal level with the states to provide a manual that would allow the states to have a better level of engagement with other states and the cities with other cities, so that they can help and participate in that diplomatic process of constructing a better engagement that opens up opportunities for Mexico at those levels as well.
Mr. Bojwani, I think, wanted to.
Excellency, my name is G.S. Iyer. I used to be the Indian ambassador in Mexico from 1999 to 2002.
Oh, sorry.
Your presentation brought back a lot of very pleasant
Please
memories about...
Please sit down. No, I'm sorry. Please sit down. No, there's only one person standing. Please sit down.
No, please, we want Indians to know.
No. Will you please sit down?
I'm so happy that this
No.
is
Please do not disrupt a meeting. Do not disrupt a meeting.
sorry, but
There's everybody present here. Please sit down.
How many students were killed in Mexico by the police?
You please sit down.
That they were taken by the police.
First, to recognize that we have those challenges. Mexico has faced challenges in many different arenas. We have had difficulties, as with the rest of the region, in terms of violence, which is something that Mexico has addressed. Mexico has increased its capacity to deal with organized crime in an important fashion over the last years. Mexico's violence peaked in 2011, and since that moment, violence has fallen down in almost all of the countries. There are specific regions where we continue to have important challenges. One of those regions, as is well known, and is being stated here, is in the case of Guerrero, where 43 students are today missing. The international, 43 students are missing. It is alleged that the municipal police in Iguala participated in their disappearance process. The Mexican federal government has condemned this in very strong and very clear fashion. The president addressed this directly. It is something that will not be tolerated in Mexico. Those municipal police that took part in these events, all of them have been already arrested and are in the process of being processed. Together with the international community, the Inter-American System of Human Rights, which instructed a series of cautelar measures. All of these measures that the international community asked for, Mexico had already taken before they were asked for, and we are participating with the international community in that process. And that means first that we are searching for the students, which we are in the process of doing, and this is being reported periodically in a transparent fashion so that it can be followed up by everyone. Secondly, we have provided and we have constant dialogue with the families of the students so that we can provide safety for those families, and together with them coordinating the process of searching for the missing students. It was asked of the federal government, and we are participating in that to provide security for the municipality of Iguala. And today the municipality of Iguala is being taken care of by the Mexican gendarmerie. So if you look at the unfortunate event, which again Mexico's government has condemned at a federal level, we are participating and reporting on the search of these students. We are providing security, and we are in constant dialogue with the families of these students. We are reporting in a transparent fashion both the search and the dialogue.
You found many mass graves. You found many mass graves. And
again, as I stated at the beginning, Mexico has had, and we have recognized, challenges that we are addressing. Mexico has had some.
The number of deaths have only increased in this government.
Actually,
I'm sorry to disturb you.
sure. Well, it's obvious that it was not dialogue that you wanted, and it was not answers that you wanted. So, but I would be happy to continue talking on other questions.
Okay.
There were, no?
Yeah, why don't you continue?
My name is G.S. I used to be the Indian ambassador in Mexico from 1999 to 2002. It was a very pleasant experience to work in a country with which we had no problems and a lot of contented relations. I saw the transition from the pre to the pan. And one of the things which I had seen a little later is that the kind of reforms which President Fox was promising at that time didn't get through the Congress. But the present president, Mr. Peña Nieto, has been able to get the approval of the Congress for a lot of economic reforms, which probably are significant for the subject of today's discussion, the new engagement with the world of Mexico. Perhaps because this is not really covered in great detail in our press also, perhaps you may like to tell us about how the things have changed in Mexico because of these reforms. particularly with something on the energy front, which would be of interest to us as a very substantial energy importing country. Thank you, sir.
And an important client of Mexico. Mexico sells a lot of oil to India, and we buy gasoline from India. So the geographic distance, regardless, we have engaged, I think, in substantial trade in the energy sector. Mexico has not enjoyed, no president in Mexico has enjoyed a majority in Congress since 1997. And many of these reforms that I talked about required not just simple majority, but actually a plurality, a qualified majority, 2/3 of Congress and half of the local legislatures. And the process by which these reforms were actually brought about was, I think, an interesting one. The main political parties, Mexico's 3 main political parties, first got together and agreed on an agenda, which was important in and of itself. They identified specific areas that they thought were not performing in Mexico as they should be. And then, after having decided on the agenda, they started working on specific ways to improve the working of each one of those sectors. In many of the cases, there was agreement in the agenda and there was agreement in the solution. All of those cases, all of those solutions were reflected in initiatives and were processed in Congress, where they reached either qualified majority or simple majority. In some cases, the processing of the solutions did not enjoy as broad a majority, and they were approved either by just the government and the party of the left, or the government and the party of the right. But I think that showed first generosity on the part of all, generosity on the part of the president and of the parties. Second, a democratic system that showed maturity, that it showed that in some cases you would not agree, but if you were able to get consensus, the consensus that law required, the initiatives would be approved and they would become law. So I think that with this generosity, with this maturity of the political system and having reached agreement on the agenda, Mexico was able in a relatively short period of time to work on a large number of issues. So at the same time as you were reforming energy, you were making your labor market more flexible, you were making your antitrust capacity stronger, you were generating better telecommunication sector, you were dealing with transparency, and the fact that you were dealing with all of these issues at the same time allowed you to generate a political consensus on a broad package, which I think improves Mexico's outlook for the future.
Mr. Bhojwani.
Thank you. Minister, welcome again to India, and thank you for your comprehensive exposition in this brief period. I've read about Mexico. I served a little bit in Latin America, unfortunately never in Mexico, but I've been reading up on it, and what inspires me about Mexico's international diplomacy, regional and international, is its pragmatic economic approach, whether NAFTA, whether the Proyecto Mesoamerica, TPP, Pacific Alliance, and so on. India's regional and intra-regional alliances have had more political content, if I may take that line. Recently, there were reports about an international sort of grouping called MICTA, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Could you shed some light on the genesis and the aims of this organization?
Yes. Again, it stems out, I think, from the analysis of the G20, at least it did in the case of Mexico. So there were a very important set of countries with which Mexico had very good dialogue and a lot of content in the relationship. But there were a set of countries that had a global voice, that were regionally relevant, and that had a lot of commonalities that we shared that we were not taking advantage of. So if you look at that specific grouping, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia, we all share some characteristics. In general, we're all large democracies. In general, we're all big economies. We're the 12th, 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th. Only Spain is out of the running, but beyond Spain, you have the 12th to the 17th economy. We all have relatively large populations. We tend to have open trade, but we tended not to talk with each other with frequency. The financial literature bunched us together in many cases. There was mints by Jim O'Neill, which included Nigeria and did not include Korea and Australia. There were the eagles, the advanced and emerging growth for the future that included us together. There were the civets. So under different categories, lots of people were identifying these countries as having similar characteristics. So we got together for the first time in the UN, and we have gotten together 3 times since and have agreed to continue to meet to see whether those commonalities that people were identifying and that we were sharing could actually, through dialogue, result in an expanded set of opportunities as a group or bilaterally. If you look at the group, it has some interesting elements to it. No? For example, Indonesia brings to the table the capacity to integrate a large diversity and pluralities of people and regions and still continue to work well. Indonesia, by the way, has more Facebook users than the UK has people. So they bring interesting things to the mix. Turkey has the 4th and the 6th most visited cities in the world. And it is one of the countries that uses, because they don't have hydrocarbon resources of their own, they are one of the countries that uses more extensively renewable energy. Korea is the country that generates more patents than any other country in the world. 7% of all patents are generated in Korea. Australia has a higher percentage of academic articles per capita of the world. So the grouping of countries, we all have enough commonalities to make the dialogue interesting, enough differences to make the dialogue constructive. We're all bridges within our relative communities. So for many reasons, it was obvious that it made sense to start talking and to see whether that dialogue resulted in the provision of more global goods, in a strengthening of global governance, and the strengthening of our bilateral relationship of countries that again had enough elements in common, but that were not used to speaking in a structured and permanent fashion.
So this meeting was supposed to conclude at 12:30. I don't know your schedule because there are 3 here and 2 there who are waiting to ask questions.
I'm happy to take the questions.
Okay. Yes, please. KP, you next, and then the gentleman here, and then we'll come there. Oh, okay.
Minister, I wanted to ask a question about the international negotiations on climate change. India, as you know, has a very strong position, and in particular that developing countries should not be obliged to have any internationally binding obligations, and we have stuck to that position. What is your view on the course of these negotiations, in particular on that point about whether developing countries should have obligations, accept international obligations or not? Thank you.
Well, that is something that we both would be capable of talking as the former Minister of Environment is here, and he was a very constructive force in COP16. Mexico has, I think, elements that make it interesting in terms of the climate change debate. We are not a large emitter. We are also a developing country. But we have come to be of the view that addressing climate change is something that is in the interest of Mexico because we are one of the countries that suffers most from the climate change effects. If you look at what Mexico spends in disaster risk management, they have multiplied by more than tenfold in the last decade. So we have gone to spending several $1 million a year to spending several $1 billion a year on the effects of climate change. The last 2 or 3 years, we have had, for the first time in almost 60 years, 1 hurricane from the Pacific and 1 from the Atlantic at exactly the same time, which meant that 2/3 of our territory were covered in torrential rains. To put it in perspective, that is equivalent to the whole region between Denmark and Sicily being covered by torrential rains, to huge dramatic effect. We had the worst hurricane that we had in our history in the Baja California Peninsula only last year. And at the same time, in the last 2 or 3 years, we have had severe droughts. In 2012, the most severe droughts that we've had in all of our history since we measure rainfalls in Mexico. So we think that it is cheaper and we think that it is worthwhile coordinating on investing and taking policy measures to avoid some of the effects of climate change, that it was saying that we did not have to assume any obligations. In many cases, because of the high increase in the price of oil, many of these technologies and efficiency and measures also made policy and economic sense. So Mexico is of a view that the consequences are so potentially severe, and we are living the consequences today as we speak, that it is worth a while to invest in trying to construct global consensus to which developing and developed countries alike are a part of. That is why we worked so hard in COP16, why we were so grateful for India's participation and capacity to construct with India important consensus on those topics, and why we think that Paris, where people expect for important advances to happen, the step in Lima is actually very relevant, because we will not have a good Paris unless we have a good COP meeting in Lima. So even though we think that the responsibilities have to be differentiated, and that many of these countries that are now developing were not part of the creation of the problem, we think that the consequences are so globally severe that we should all strive to be part of the solution.
Yes, please.
Your Excellency, Mr. Mead and Mr. Tinan, thank you very much for inviting us from Houston, Texas. Myself and my partner, Mr. Lal Padilla, we came all the way from Houston, Texas. No better timing than seeing you here in India regarding Mexico's new engagement with the world. My very specific question is regarding Pemex. The depleting assets of Pemex are a challenge. And then this can be engaged between the three countries, US, India, and Mexico. We can address those challenges and make them into an opportunity. The onshore, offshore assets, as we speak, are just depleting. And we are here to court a few good companies with us, take us with us to Pemex and to Mexico, to make sure that we increase.
So we went to having one mega field in Cantarell, to having to exploit from mature fields, from challenging fields inland to deep water, and continue to explore in shallow waters. So the requirements of capital and technology of the fields that Mexico will now have to take advantage of were fields that required a better regulatory environment to attract that capital and that technology. We share with the US shale gas resources, important shale gas resources, but if you look at the investment of the US in deep water and of the US in shale, and compare them with what Mexico was investing in deep water and in shale, the difference was very important, and in a way it was so important because of the way that our regulation was set up. So we think that energy reform has the potential to bring to Mexico good partners in terms of technology and capital, and we very much think that part of that talent could be found in India and elsewhere. So we think that is something that we should talk about, especially given the fact that India today is both an important client and an important supplier of hydrocarbon to Mexico. We sell oil to India, and we buy refined products from India. So in a way, Pemex and India already know each other well. So it should be a natural fit for us, for both energy sectors, to be much more active than they have been up to date.
KP?
KP Nair, the Telegraph newspaper. Dr. Mead, can you tell us something about the role of soft power in Mexico's engagement with the world? Correct me if I'm wrong. Out of the 50 states in the United States, you have consular posts in 48 of them as an instrument of hard power, but also in cities like Washington, you have very strong cultural centers. But that is not the case in your engagement of Asia, for example. Secondly, tequila could be an instrument of Mexico's soft power in engaging the world, but I find that in the high-end bars in India, cachaça and caipirinha or pisco sour is more easily available than the better tequilas from Guadalajara. So what do you see as the role of tequila in Mexico's use of soft power in engaging the world?
In Mexico, we have both tequila and mezcal. In the case of mezcal, we say in Spanish, and I'll translate because there's many people that do speak Spanish here, para todo mal mezcal y para todo bien también. So for every evil mezcal and for every good also. So we think that that tequila and mezcal are always appropriate, and we think that it is something that we should foster. As we should foster also our soft culture. And our soft culture and our soft power goes beyond just culture. We have the largest presence of any other country in the world in terms of the consular presence that we have in the US. We display our culture in the US in a systemic and important fashion. There is no single day in the US where Mexico is not displaying in one part of the territory some aspect of its cultural importance. And we are trying to engage in culture and in other elements of our soft power beyond the US. We have put together the most important exhibit on Mayan art that has ever been put forward, and we are going to take that, we should take that to China, to India, I'm sorry, we should talk a little bit more about that as we have meetings in the days that follow, but we're going to take it to China, we took it to Brazil, it is now in France, and no other place could you see so much Mayan art put together that you could now see in Mexico. That is something that we should do jointly. We should even try to display our soft power jointly. No two countries could put together an exhibit on ancient civilizations as India and Mexico could. But beyond culture and our soft power, we also want to talk about democracy, about making democracy work, about transparency. They were able to talk in India about our challenges because Mexico has been very transparent about what our challenges are, what our difficulties in dealing with those challenges are, and our disposition to deal with those challenges in a transparent and open fashion. Clearly, some were not happy that we were transparent about it and decided that dialogue was not worthwhile, and they chose to leave instead, which we think it's a bad idea. Mexico is happy to, in a transparent fashion, engage in the challenges that we have. And that is part of what today is Mexico's soft power as well. But we will be happy to display more diplomatic efforts, and I'm sure Ambassador will be happy in making tequila a big part of that diplomatic effort.
Second last question over there, yeah.
Freelance journalist. With the coming into effect of NAFTA 20 years ago, the whole question of Indian land rights and sense of empowerment sort of burst onto the international, came to international attention with the Zapatista uprising. The Zapatistas are lying low these days and are engaged in sort of constructive programs, strengthening municipal self-government and all that. But could you tell us what is being done to enhance the sense of grievance and the issues, the economic issues that led to that uprising? And are you confident that, that they've been tackled enough? Thanks.
That goes back, I think, to the first question or to the topics that we are addressing in terms of poverty. So clearly, in 1994, Chiapas was a state that was deprived of access to many elements that were important. I think since then, if you see our deficit in access, that has been reduced dramatically in the last 20 years by almost any metric that you choose to take into consideration. If you look at people that have access to Social Security, people that have access to health, which in Mexico today is almost universal, people that have access to education, where we now have universal access to primary education, and we're in the process of increasing it for mid and high level education as well. Electricity, more than 99% of people today have access to electricity, to clean water, to drainage. So in all metrics that you want to choose in terms as to measure access, you will find that Mexico has come a long way since 1994 up until today. Again, we still have challenges. There's still poverty. There's still extreme poverty. There's important imbalances and inequality. We have issues also with violence and with drugs that we are also facing. But all in all, these 20 years have not been just positive for trade and positive for growth, but they have also been positive in terms of reducing the disparities between the most extreme and the middle class. Our middle class has grown by a lot in the last 20 years. So there's no single social indicator where we have not made substantial progress towards universal access in the last 20 years.
Finally.
Yeah, Mr. Minister, do you have any vision to have a collaboration with India in science and technology? Because India is very rich in technology, particularly Mars achievement is very rare in the world. Similarly, we are good in BrahMos, IT technology, medical science. Like this, why not to have some collaboration or exchange programs, scientists like that?
We're actually part of the binational commission that we now have, and part of the architecture that we want to construct with India would allow us to have more cooperation in science and technology in topics that one would not have imagined some years back. For example, the day after tomorrow, we're going to sign a memorandum of understanding between India and Mexico on the exploration of space, where India has become a major player. Not only are they putting satellites on space on a more regular basis, they're exploring the orbits of Mars. So India is at a forefront on many topics of science, of technology that Mexico would like to take or to benefit from. And it will not be the first case of successful cooperation. In a way, the Green Revolution was a revolution that also brought Mexico and India together in terms of devising and designing ways in which seeds could provide more foodstuff than it was providing before. So we can point to dramatic examples in the past of successful collaboration scientifically between India and Mexico. We can point to dramatic things that we could be together in the future, in the case, for example, of what India is doing in space. And in order to take advantage of everything in between, we are signing we are providing from the legal infrastructure to make those exchanges more broad, more systematic, and more important. Mexico very much recognizes India's potential in science and technology, and we very much think that it is part of the belongings that both of those countries have. Mexico is also at the forefront of research in many topics where India is not as advanced, and Mexico recognizes in India many topics where Mexico is not as advanced, and we recognize many topics in where both India and Mexico are doing very good work. So if you look at the relationship, we think that there are some numbers that point to the health of that relationship, and there are numbers where there's a lot of potential, but there's still deficit. Science and technology is one such area. We don't do enough, but the potential is huge.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mead. I know there are more questions waiting, but I think we do have to call a close. The ambassador's busy signaling to me. So I must thank you. Before the meeting began, I was told that you have a very impressive track record, and we can see with great ease with which you answered all the questions. Thank you very much for addressing them seriously. And I must thank everybody present for being here, and also apologize for the disturbance that we had in the meeting. But may I close with a request that we all compliment Dr. Mead. Thank you very much.
It was fun.